My name is Linda Marlowe. I am 68 years old, a retired nurse who spent 4 decades working long shifts in small mountain clinics. I bandaged wounds, delivered babies, and sat through countless nights holding the hands of people I barely knew. That is what I did with my life, caring quietly, making sure others could stand again. I thought my reward for all of this would be peace. I was wrong. The day that changed everything did not begin with thunder or shouting. It began with a knock on my kitchen door, sharp and polite. I dried my hands on my apron and opened it to find my daughter-in-law, Sophie, standing on the porch in her winter coat. Her smile was too polished to be warm. Beside her was a man I had never seen before, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as an attorney. Sophie stepped forward with a grace that felt rehearsed. She placed a folder on my kitchen table as if she were setting down a casserole dish. The folder was thick, with bold black letters on the front. Durable power of attorney. My son, Michael, was not with her. That absence told me more than words ever could. I sat across from her, my fingers resting on a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initial T, the one my husband Thomas had given me years ago. Sophie leaned forward. "We only want to help, Mother," she said. "Michael and I worry about you here, living alone. This is just a formality. It ensures you are safe, that the mountain lodges your husband left, you will be cared for properly." The moment she spoke of the lodges, my heart stilled. They were not simply properties. They were the life's work of my late husband, cabins built into the ridges of the Carolina mountains, weathered by snow and wind, yet standing proud. 20 years of his sweat and vision. Before he died, he had transferred them into a trust in my name, a fortress of wood and law. He had told me in his last days, "Do not sign anything, Linda. Keep silent, and one day you will understand why." And now I understood. Sophie's voice was calm, practiced, like a teacher coaxing a child to read. But the lawyer's presence shifted the air in my kitchen. His pen was already uncapped, his hand hovering as if my signature was inevitable. I could hear the kettle behind me beginning to whistle, a small, rising cry. I did not move. I lifted the spoon in my teacup and let it slip against the porcelain. The metallic chime rang like a bell in the silence. That sound told me what words could not. They were not here for my safety. They were here to take what Thomas had built. I kept my gaze steady on Sophie. She was beautiful, younger than my son by 3 years, her hair perfectly set, her perfume filling the small room. But behind her soft features was a calculation as sharp as the mountain wind. She tapped the folder lightly. "You will not even notice the difference," she promised. "Life will be easier." Inside me, 100 memories rose at once. Thomas hauling timber up a slope with his calloused hands. The smell of pine resin in his shirt when he came home late. His voice whispering in the dark, telling me the lodges were more than money. They were our testament that ordinary people could build something permanent. Sophie's lawyer slid the folder closer. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said, "all we need is your signature right here. One stroke, and you can rest easy." I wanted to laugh, but I did not. I wanted to weep, but I would not. Instead, I folded the handkerchief, once more, and placed it firmly on the table. My silence filled the room. In that silence, I remembered Thomas's last grip on my hand, fierce even in weakness. "One day, Linda, silence will save you." That day had come. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering. The lawyer cleared his throat. The kettle screamed behind me, yet I did not rise. I let the moment stretch, heavy and unbroken. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. I will think about it. Not yes. Not no. Only the armor of delay. They gathered their things, expecting victory soon. But as the door closed, I touched the brass key in my pocket, the key to the safe that held every deed. And I whispered into the empty air, not for them, but for Thomas. When my son got married, I said nothing about the $75 million in mountain lodges you left me. Thankfully, I kept silent. Because today, that silence is the only thing standing between us and their hands. The house was quiet again. The tea had gone cold. But my silence had never burned brighter. I often replay the wedding day in my mind, not because I want to, but because the silence of that room still echoes inside me. After Sophie and the lawyer left my kitchen with their folder, I sat staring at the handkerchief on the table, and my memory pulled me backward, back to the beginning of it all. Back to the day Michael said his vows, and I realized my place in his new life. The church was filled with music, soft and elegant, violins rising above the murmur of guests. Everyone wore their finest clothes. Faces glowed with joy and champagne. I wore a blue dress. The same shade Thomas had once said reminded him of twilight. I chose it for him, though he was no longer there to see me. I pinned the handkerchief into my clutch, folded neat, so I could hold onto a part of him while I watched our only child marry. When I arrived, I expected to sit in the first row, as mothers often do. But when I asked the usher where my seat was, he guided me toward the far side of the hall, near a thick pillar decorated with flowers. The seat was tucked so far back that when the bride walked down the aisle, my view was half blocked. I smiled at the usher anyway, because kindness had become my armor. Yet in that moment, I understood. I was not meant to be seen. From my place in the shadows, I watched Sophie glide toward Michael. Her gown sparkled under the lights. Guests turned their heads, whispering, admiration. My son's face was lit with a joy I had not seen since he was a boy, climbing the pines outside our lodge. His eyes were full of her, and only her. The priest spoke words of blessing, and I folded my hands together. I thought of Thomas and how he would have squeezed my fingers, his pride shining for Michael. Instead, my hands were empty, and the only thing warm against my palm was the stitched letter T on that old handkerchief. During the reception, laughter rang like bells. Champagne glasses clinked. The band played songs people knew by heart. I sat at a round table tucked near the restrooms, the scent of disinfectant drifting between courses of roast chicken and potatoes. Names of other guests were printed neatly on cards at their places. My card was missing. A cousin of Sophie's joined the table briefly and asked if I was with the staff. When I told him I was Michael's mother, his cheeks turned red, and he excused himself quickly. I pretended not to notice, but my chest tightened as though the music was pressing against my ribs. Michael and Sophie danced, turning under lights strung like stars. He did not look my way. Once, during the toasts, I thought our eyes met, but it was fleeting, like a shadow across glass. The best man raised a glass to Sophie's beauty and her future, but my name was never spoken. My existence went unmentioned, as though I had already been folded into the past. The cruelest part was not their words, but the absence of them. No public insult, no cutting remark, just the soft erasure of being left out, as though I had been misplaced in the story of my own family. Silence can wound deeper than shouting. It digs into the spaces where recognition should live, leaving emptiness behind. When the cake was served, I rose quietly and went outside. Snow had begun to fall, tiny flakes clinging to the church steps. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and breathed in the cold. I told myself I was strong, that Thomas would not want me to crumble. Yet the truth is, standing in the night, I felt like a ghost at my own son's wedding. Later, as I drove home alone, the headlights cut through the storm. I whispered aloud, as if to Thomas, "They placed me in the shadows, but I will not disappear." My voice trembled, but the words gave me strength. That night, sitting by the window of my empty kitchen, I understood why silence could be a shield. Because I had already learned how it felt to be unseen. And I swore to myself that though they might push me aside, they would never take from me what Thomas and I had built. Driving home from the wedding that night, I thought not of Sophie's gown or Michael's vows, but of wood and stone and snow. I thought of the mountain lodges Thomas and I built together, piece by piece, over decades. As the wipers cleared the glass, my mind drifted back to when it all began, when our lives were less complicated and our hands were always dirty with work. Thomas was a carpenter before he became a dreamer. He used to say that building with wood was the closest a man could come to leaving fingerprints on the earth. When we were young, he found a plot of rugged land nestled in the Carolina mountains. It was wild, nearly untouchable, but he looked at it the way some men look at gold. He told me, "Linda, this is where we will build something that lasts." We started with one cabin. It was modest, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a tin roof that rattled when the rain came. I remember standing barefoot on the raw planks, painting the walls with my own hands while our son played with blocks in the corner. We had no money for laborers, so Thomas hauled the timber himself, carrying it up the slope on his back. His hands cracked, his nails blackened, but his eyes shone each night when he said, "One day, people will come here to rest, to heal, to breathe." That first lodge was rented out by hikers who wrote their thanks in a leather journal we kept by the hearth. I still have that journal, the pages crinkled with years of fire, smoke, and gratitude. Each note reminded us that what we were doing was not just business. It was offering shelter, a small piece of peace to strangers. From that one cabin grew 2, then 4, then 12. Thomas learned how to bargain with lumber yards. I learned how to cook for crews of men who came to help in later years. We planted pines to frame the driveways, painted shutters a deep green to match the forest, and carved signs that read, "Marlow Mountain Lodges." By the time Michael was in high school, the lodges had become a retreat for families, honeymooners, and weary travelers. But what mattered most to Thomas was not the income. It was the permanence. He used to sit on the porch with me at dusk, watching the mountains turn purple as the sun fell, and he would whisper, "These walls will stand long after we're gone. Our love is nailed into every beam." When his illness came, it was sudden, cruel, and short. In his final months, he spoke less about pain and more about the lodges. He was afraid, not of death, but of what would happen to the work of his life. One evening, his voice rasping, he pressed the embroidered handkerchief into my hand. The letter T was stitched in the corner, rough but steady. "Do not let anyone take them, Linda," he said. "They are not just money. They are proof that we were here. Silence, if you must, but never surrender." I promised him, and I kept that promise by placing the deeds into a trust that bore only my name. The lawyer who helped us set it up explained it was the strongest shield we could use. As long as I lived, no one could force me to give them away. Unless, of course, I signed them over. That was the truth Sophie and her lawyer leaned on. They knew the lodges were worth $75 million, maybe more. They also knew my son's signature meant nothing. Only mine mattered. That was why they came to my kitchen, dressed in smiles, but armed with paper. As I think back to those early days, when Thomas's laughter echoed across the ridges and Michael's small footprints marked the fresh snow, I cannot imagine signing those memories away. The lodges are not an investment. They are our family carved into the mountain. Every beam a story, every nail a sacrifice. I sit now with the handkerchief folded in my lap, the stitch of Thomas's initial worn smooth by my thumb. I remind myself that silence is not weakness. It is the way I honor him. And it is the way I will protect what we built together, even when the people closest to me see only dollar signs. After Thomas passed, the house felt like an echo chamber. Every corner carried his absence. Every object reminded me of what I had lost. The lodge keys hung neatly on their rack, silent, waiting for his hand to take them down. The kettle on the stove still whistled the same way, but without his footsteps coming down the hall, the sound was hollow. Michael was my only comfort then. For a while, he came often, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, asking about bills, repairs, guests at the lodges. His presence reminded me that I was still needed. Yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his visits grew shorter. Phone calls replaced them. Then the phone calls grew rarer, swallowed by the busyness of his life. I told myself it was natural. Sons grow up, build their own lives. I wanted him to. But I had not expected how quickly I would become background noise. When he introduced me to Sophie, I searched for reasons to embrace her. She was younger, polished, with a practiced warmth. She complimented my cooking, admired the view from my porch, called me mother, with a smile that never reached her eyes. I tried to ignore the way her gaze lingered on the family photographs displayed on the mantel, especially the framed deed of the lodges Thomas had once insisted we keep there as a symbol. Her interest was not in the faces, but in the paper. In gatherings, Sophie made herself the center. She told stories with wide gestures, her laughter ringing louder than anyone else's. People adored her for it. I watched Michael lean toward her, captivated, as though the air itself depended on her approval. My words, when I offered them, seemed to drift past him unheard. At first, I thought it was jealousy, that old wound of mothers who struggled to let go of their sons. But in quiet moments, when Sophie's smile fell away and her voice hardened, I recognized something different. Ambition, the kind that consumed. She asked questions about the lodges, about trust documents, about whether I ever grew tired of all that responsibility. I answered carefully, but inside I felt the ground shifting. There were dinners where I spoke barely 10 words. Sophie carried every conversation, and Michael followed her lead. Once, when I tried to tell a story about Thomas hauling timber through the snow, Sophie cut me off with a laugh. "Times are different now," she said. "Nobody does that kind of work anymore." The table laughed with her. Michael smiled too, and my story dissolved into silence. It was in those silences that I felt the empty space grow, not just the space beside me in bed, where Thomas once slept, but the space between mother and son, stretched wider by every word Sophie chose, and every word Michael did not say. I tried to fill that space with patience. I baked pies and left them on their doorstep. I knitted scarves, choosing colors Michael liked as a child. They thanked me politely, but I saw Sophie place the scarves in a closet, untouched. My gestures could not bridge the distance. Late at night, I sat with the handkerchief Thomas had given me, pressing it to my face as though fabric could carry his voice. I wished he were there to tell me how to hold our son without smothering him, how to stand firm without driving him further away. One evening, after a strained dinner, I overheard Sophie say to Michael in the driveway, "Your mother lives too much in the past. She does not see what needs to be done." His answer was low, but I caught the words. She will understand eventually. The ache of that moment was sharper than grief. Grief had taken Thomas from me, but this was different. This was my son, still alive, yet already turning away. That was when I understood the true emptiness. Not the rooms of the house, not the seat beside me at church, but the space in my son's heart where my voice no longer reached. And in that silence, I knew Sophie's presence was no accident. She was filling the gap between us, and she was determined to keep it that way. The evening after I overheard Sophie in the driveway, I sat alone in the den with the handkerchief Thomas had given me. The lamplight cast a warm glow across the walls, but the room felt colder than the mountain air outside. I traced the rough stitching of the letter T with my thumb and closed my eyes, hearing his voice as clearly as if he were sitting across from me. "Linda," he had said in those final weeks, his body frail, yet his grip strong around my hand. "Silence will be your armor. Do not let anyone talk you out of what we built. Promise me you will not sign a thing. Promise me you will guard the lodges." I promised, though at the time I did not understand the weight of it. I thought he was clinging to sentiment, to memories carved in wood and stone. Only now, watching Sophie weave her way deeper into Michael's trust, did I grasp the depth of his warning. Thomas had seen further than I could. The lodges were not just cabins in the mountains. They were the marrow of our family, the proof of sacrifice and sweat. They were also a fortune, worth more than I could ever spend. To some, that kind of value is irresistible. And Thomas knew that after he was gone, those lodges would become a magnet for ambition. His silence had been his shield. Mine would have to be the same. One memory in particular returned with sharpness. We were sitting on the porch of the largest lodge, the one with wide beams that creaked in the wind. The valley below stretched endless and green. Thomas leaned close and whispered, "If anyone ever pressures you, do not argue. Do not shout. Just hold your silence. Silence confuses those who think they already own you." I had laughed then, teasing him for his melodrama, but he did not laugh back. His eyes were steady, carrying a seriousness I had not seen since the day Michael was born. It unsettled me, but I brushed it away. I wish I had not. Now, with Sophie's questions still echoing in my ears, that memory pressed against me like a stone on my chest. I realized I had been naive to think her interest in our family history was harmless curiosity. Her laughter at the dinner table, her cutting remark about living in the past, it was all part of the same story. A story Thomas had already predicted. I folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it in the drawer beside me. The weight of his words returned, heavier now than when they were first spoken. He had not asked me to fight. He had not told me to confront. He had told me to wait, to let silence stand where anger might fail. That night, I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window as the snow fell outside. Each flake struck the glass softly, soundless yet relentless, covering the ground in quiet armor. Watching it, I thought of Thomas's lesson. Snow does not argue with the wind. It simply falls, silently, until it covers everything. Perhaps that was what he wanted me to understand. In the quiet, I spoke aloud to him, though only the walls listened. I hear you now. I will not argue with them. I will not beg Michael to remember who I am. I will stay still, and when the time comes, they will find silence harder than any word I could ever speak. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, shrill and insistent, but I let it cry out until it hushed on its own. Some noises do not deserve an answer. The next day, Sophie came again, her smile bright, her voice sweet. She asked if I had considered signing some insurance papers to make things easier. I listened, nodded, and poured her tea. I said nothing. The silence unsettled her. I saw it in the way her eyes darted, in the way her hand fidgeted with her cup. She expected resistance, maybe even anger. She did not know what to do with quiet. Thomas had been right. Silence is not surrender. It is strategy. And though my heart ached, though I wanted to cry out, for Michael to see through the illusion, I held my tongue. I let Sophie leave with her questions unanswered. As the door closed, I whispered the words Thomas had left me. Silence will be your armor. And for the first time, I felt the strength in them. The morning after Sophie's visit, I heard the crunch of boots on snow outside my porch. When I opened the door, I saw Eleanor, my neighbor from across the ridge, wrapped in her thick red coat and a knitted hat pulled low over her ears. She carried a small basket of muffins, steam rising from them in the cold air. Eleanor was 72, a widow like me, though her losses were of a different kind. She had outlived not only her husband, but also her sense of trust in family. She had once owned a farm further down the valley, land passed through generations, until it was signed away with a stroke of a pen. Not her pen, her nephew's. He had convinced her to grant him control over her property, promising to manage things for her. Within months, the land was gone, sold off to pay debts he never explained. She never spoke of it often, but when she did, her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned the hard way that blood does not always protect. "Morning, Linda," she said as she stepped inside. Her eyes moved quickly over the room, as though sensing the echo of Sophie's presence still clinging to the air. "You've had visitors." I nodded and poured her coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Sophie had placed the folder the day before. I pushed the basket of muffins between us. Eleanor broke hers in half, the steam curling upward. "I can tell from your face. They came asking you to sign something, didn't they?" Her bluntness startled me. "How did you know?" She gave a dry laugh. "Because I know the look of a woman being cornered. I wore that face for months before I finally lost everything." The room grew quiet. Outside, the snow was falling heavier, wrapping the pines in white. I thought of Thomas's warning, of the silence he had taught me to hold. Eleanor sipped her coffee and leaned closer. "I'll tell you the truth, Linda. Silence is powerful, yes, but silence alone won't stop them from trying again and again. You need to know exactly where you stand." I listened, the words pulling against my heart. Eleanor's story was a mirror of what I feared could happen to me. Her nephew had not stormed in with threats. He had come with gentle smiles, with reassurances, just like Sophie. And she'd signed, trusting that family meant safety. I kept waiting for someone to realize what was happening, Eleanor continued, but no one came. By the time I understood, My farm was gone. I had to pack my life into boxes and rent a room in town. That kind of betrayal, it teaches you to see through masks. I studied her face, lined and weathered, but alive with strength. She was not bitter, though she had every right to be. She was simply steady, a warning carved into flesh and bone. "Do not give them your signature," she said, her voice low, steady as stone. "Do not let guilt or loneliness soften you. They will try to make you feel selfish. They will tell you that refusing means you do not love your son. But love is not measured in how much you surrender. It is measured in what you protect." Her words struck me like a bell. I thought of Michael, his smile once so open, now clouded by Sophie's shadow. Could I really hold firm against him if he stood before me, asking with pleading eyes? Could I risk losing the last thread of closeness between us? Eleanor seemed to read my thoughts. She reached across the table and pressed my hand. "I know the ache, but if you give in, you won't just lose the lodges, you'll lose yourself. And once that happens, there's no way back." I looked down at the handkerchief folded in my lap. Thomas's stitched initial reminded me of who I had been and who I still needed to be. Silence was my armor, yes, but wisdom, borrowed from those who had already walked this path, was my compass. As Eleanor left that morning, she paused at the door, her figure framed against the falling snow. "Remember, Linda," she said, "impossible as it feels, sometimes the greatest act of love is holding your ground." When the door closed, the house was quiet again. Yet this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like a shield, stronger for having been shared. That night, after Eleanor left, I could not sleep. Her words followed me into every shadow of the house. I lit a single lamp in the living room and sat at the desk Thomas had built for Michael when he was still a boy. The wood was scratched from years of use, each mark a story. On the desk sat a stack of plain stationery, yellowed at the edges. Without thinking too much, I pulled a sheet forward and began to write. The first letter began simply, "Dear Thomas." My hand trembled, the ink blotting at the curve of his name. I told him everything I had not said aloud to anyone else. About the wedding, about Sophie's careful smile, about Michael's distance, his silence where once there had been laughter. I confessed the ache of being placed in the shadows, of feeling erased in the story of my own family. By the time I signed my name, the page was wet with tears. I folded it and placed it in the drawer beside the handkerchief. Somehow, writing to him made me feel less alone, as if the words bridged the gap between life and death. One letter was not enough. I took another sheet, and this time I wrote to Michael. I told him about the day he was born, the way Thomas had cried when he held him for the first time. I described the sound of his laughter echoing in the mountains, how he once said the lodges smelled like Christmas all year. I wrote of the pride that filled me every time he came home muddy from work, tired but strong. And then, slowly, I wrote the truth, that I feared losing him, not to death, but to choices that were not his own. I wrote that love is not measured by what we give away, but by what we preserve. I did not know if he would ever read those words, but I needed to write them, all the same. The clock ticked past midnight. Snow pressed against the windows, the storm heavy and quiet. The house was still except for the scratch of my pen. I wrote a third letter, this one to myself. It began, "Dear Linda." I told myself that I was stronger than the doubt creeping into my bones, that Thomas's voice was still alive in the walls, in the trees, in the very timbers of the lodges. I reminded myself that silence was not weakness. It was patience. Page after page, filled with words that no one might ever see. Each letter folded carefully, stacked in a wooden box that had once held Thomas's tools. With every fold, I felt lighter, though the ache never vanished entirely. At some point in the early hours, I rose to pour tea. The kettle's whistle startled me, breaking the rhythm of my writing. I carried the cup back to the desk and held it between my palms, the steam rising like breath. I looked at the pile of letters, fragile yet solid. They were proof that even in solitude, my voice had not been taken. Before dawn, I opened the window a crack. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of pine and snow. I whispered into the darkness, "Thomas, I am keeping my promise. I will not sign, not for Sophie, not even for Michael. These lodges are our story, and I will not erase it." The words vanished into the night, but speaking them aloud steadied me. I closed the window and returned to the desk. I pressed the handkerchief to my lips and placed it on top of the letters. Together, they formed a kind of altar, a reminder of what still bound me to life. When the first light of morning touched the mountains, I was still awake. My eyes were swollen, my hand cramped, but my spirit was steadier. The night of letters had not solved my problems, but it had given me strength. I realized that sometimes the act of writing is its own kind of silence. It does not demand an answer. It simply waits. And so I waited, watching the pale sun climb over the ridge, ready for whatever would come next. The morning after my long night of writing, I thought perhaps I had imagined it all. The storm outside had softened, the sky clearing over the ridge. Sunlight spilled across the snow, sparkling so brightly it was almost hard to look at. I told myself that maybe Sophie would let the matter rest, that maybe Michael would remember who I was and what the lodges meant. Hope is stubborn like that. It lingers even where it has no right to. By late afternoon, I heard the familiar rumble of Michael's truck on the drive. My heart lifted, foolishly, as it always did when I knew he was near. I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothed my hair, and opened the door with a smile. But the smile faltered when I saw Sophie step down from the passenger seat, her heels clicking against the frozen gravel. She carried a leather folder under her arm. Michael kissed my cheek distractedly, his eyes tired, his movements rushed. "We won't stay long, Mom," he said. "There's just something we need to go over." I invited them inside, trying to steady my breathing. Sophie set the folder on the kitchen table, the same spot where she had placed one before. The repetition made my stomach tighten. She spoke lightly, her tone almost cheerful. "We thought it would be good to make things official. Just small details, nothing complicated. You wouldn't even notice the difference." Michael nodded, avoiding my eyes. "It's just to make sure everything is managed smoothly. With the lodges. With everything." I poured tea, the whistle of the kettle filling the silence. My hands shook slightly as I placed the cups before them. Sophie opened the folder and slid a document across the table. The words "Power of Attorney" stood in bold at the top. A pen rested neatly beside it. I stared at the paper, the letters swimming. My throat felt tight. Michael shifted uncomfortably, as though he wanted to be anywhere else. Sophie filled the silence with her soft, practiced voice. "We only want to help you, Mother. You've carried this weight alone for too long." Imagine the relief of letting us take care of everything. Relief. The word echoed cruelly. Relief was what Thomas had given me every time he came home safe from the mountain slopes, his arms full of timber. Relief was hearing Michael's laughter when he was small, knowing he was still innocent. This paper was not relief. It was erasure. I lifted the spoon in my cup and let it clink against the porcelain. The sound rang through the room, sharper than I expected. Sophie's smile flickered. Michael rubbed his temple. In that moment, I remembered Eleanor's words. They will tell you refusing means you don't love your son. And I remembered Thomas's warning. Silence will be your armor. I wanted to cry out, to ask Michael if he truly believed I could hand over everything Thomas and I built. But I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he leaned toward Sophie for strength, and I held my tongue. Words would only deepen the chasm. Silence, I told myself. Silence. I folded my hands over the handkerchief in my lap and let the moment stretch. The kettle hissed softly as it cooled on the stove. Sophie cleared her throat, trying again. It's only paperwork, really. Everyone does it. Families take care of each other this way. Finally, I raised my eyes to hers. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply looked at her until she shifted in her chair. Then, with a calm voice, I said, I will think about it. Michael exhaled in relief, as though my answer was close enough to yes. Sophie closed the folder gently, masking her frustration with another smile. They left soon after, their footsteps crunching away into the snow. When the house was quiet again, I touched the handkerchief and whispered to Thomas, I did not sign. Not today. My voice trembled, but it was true. My silence had been enough to hold them off, for now. That evening, after Michael and Sophie drove away, I sat in the quiet kitchen with the untouched teacups still cooling on the table. Their shadows lingered long after they left, as though the house itself had absorbed their presence. The folder was gone, but the weight of it pressed against me all the same. I pressed the embroidered handkerchief to my lips, trying to steady my breathing. My silence had held them back this time, but I knew they would return. Sophie was not the kind of woman who gave up after one attempt. And Michael, my sweet boy, seemed to follow her lead now, his eyes dull with exhaustion, and hope twisted into something unrecognizable. The storm outside had quieted, but inside me, another storm was gathering. I found myself speaking aloud, though no one was there to hear. What if they are right, Thomas? What if I am being stubborn? What if signing would make things easier for everyone? I imagined his answer, the steady calm of his voice. Easier does not mean better, Linda, and surrender is not love. The words echoed in my mind, yet still the ache of doubt gnawed at me. Could refusing really be an act of love? Or was I only clinging to the past because it was all I had left? I walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered ridge. The lodges stood there, dark shapes against the pale hills, guardians of our history. They had weathered blizzards, floods, and storms. They had not crumbled. Was I weaker than wood and stone? Sitting back down, I folded my hands and began an inner dialogue that felt more like a trial than comfort. If you love Michael, one voice whispered inside me, you will give him what he needs. He says the lodges are too much for you. He says Sophie can manage them better. Do you not trust your own son? But if I sign, another voice argued, I erase Thomas's life work. I erase the promise I made at his deathbed. How can I betray the man who built every beam with his hands? The voices battled in me, until I could hardly tell which belonged to reason and which belonged to fear. I remembered Eleanor's words, steady as stone. They will tell you refusing means you do not love your son. Do not believe it. She had already lived the ruin I now faced. Was I wise enough to learn from her, or doomed to repeat it? I whispered into the silence. If I refuse, Michael may turn away from me completely. If I agree, I lose the lodges, and with them Thomas. Which is the greater loss? No answer came, only the sound of the old clock ticking on the wall. I closed my eyes and pictured Michael as a child, running barefoot across the porch, his laughter ringing like bells. He would gather pine cones and bring them to me proudly, as though they were treasures. That boy had trusted me without question, his small hand wrapped in mine. Now his grown hand pushed papers toward me, guided by another woman's ambition. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying would not bring clarity. I pressed the handkerchief tighter and breathed slowly. At last, I wrote the questions down, line by line, as though seeing them on paper might give me strength. If I sign, will Michael love me more? If I refuse, will he stop loving me? If I yield, who will protect the lodges when I am gone? If I hold firm, what legacy will I leave him? The page filled with questions and no answers. Yet in that sea of uncertainty, one truth rose above all others. My silence was not cowardice. It was the only shield I had left. I folded the paper, placed it with the letters from the night before, and whispered once more to myself, love is not measured by surrender. It is measured by what we protect. And though doubt still gnawed at me, I felt the faintest glimmer of strength return. The day after my long dialogue with myself, I woke to the sound of the phone ringing. At first, I thought it might be Michael, calling to apologize, to explain, to reassure me that he had not forgotten who I was. But when I lifted the receiver, the voice on the other end was lower, steadier, and oddly familiar. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said, "this is Arthur Blake. I was a friend of Thomas's. Do you remember me?" The name stirred something in me. Arthur had been at our table many years ago, a quiet man with sharp eyes who helped Thomas with legal documents when the lodges began to expand. He had been present the day we signed the trust papers, his hand guiding the pen as Thomas pressed his signature with determination. I remembered the way Thomas had clasped Arthur's shoulder afterward and said, "I trust you." "Yes, Mr. Blake," I answered slowly. "I remember." "I heard from Eleanor that you might need counsel," he said gently. "She told me there's been pressure about the lodges." Eleanor again, her presence weaving through my life like a thread of quiet protection. I agreed to meet Arthur, and that afternoon he came up the ridge, his car tires crunching in the snow. When he stepped inside, time seemed to fold. His hair was grayer, his face lined, but his eyes were the same, clear, precise, searching. He carried a worn leather briefcase, not unlike the one Sophie's lawyer had brought, but in his hands it looked less like a weapon and more like a shield. We sat at the table, where Sophie had placed her folder. Arthur opened his case and drew out a copy of the trust papers Thomas had signed years ago. He laid them flat, smoothing the creases with deliberate care. "Mrs. Marlowe," he began, "I want you to understand something. These lodges cannot be taken from you as long as you do not sign anything. The trust is airtight. Thomas made certain of it. I helped him. He knew this day might come." Hearing that sent a shiver through me. "He knew?" I whispered. Arthur nodded. Thomas was not only a builder of cabins, he was a builder of foresight. He said to me, "One day someone may try to push Linda into surrendering what we built. Make sure she cannot lose it without her own hand." That is why we structured the trust as we did. It is unbreakable unless you willingly undo it. I touched the papers, tracing Thomas's signature. My chest ached at the memory of his steady hand, the way he had looked at me that day with quiet fire. Arthur leaned forward. "Do not be deceived. Their strategy is not legal strength. It is emotional leverage. They will appeal to your love, your guilt, your loneliness. They will tell you surrender is kindness. But legally, you are safe. Silence and refusal are all you need." The weight in my heart lightened, though only slightly. But if Michael believes I am selfish, if he turns away completely? Arthur's voice softened. Then he will learn in time that a mother's duty is not to give away her soul, but to preserve it. If he loves you, he will come back. If he does not, then no signature in the world would have kept him. I swallowed hard, tears threatening but held back. His words were steady, logical, but they carried a compassion that reached deeper than law. "Thomas trusted me," Arthur added. "But more than that, he trusted you. He said, 'Linda will know when silence must speak.' That trust is yours to keep." We spent the afternoon going over details, bank accounts, property deeds, contingency plans. Arthur showed me how to freeze certain accounts if necessary, how to redirect any inquiries through him. "If they come again," he said firmly, "do not face them alone. Tell them to speak to me. That is what I am here for." When he left, I walked him to the porch. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the snow in gold. Arthur shook my hand and said, "Remember, Mrs. Marlowe, your strength is not in fighting, it is in standing." After his car disappeared down the ridge, I stood in the cold until the stars began to show. For the first time in many nights, I felt less alone. Thomas's foresight, Eleanor's warning, Arthur's counsel, they formed a circle around me. I whispered into the wind, "I will not sign." The words carried away, steady and sure. And in that moment, silence felt less like a burden and more like a weapon carefully sheathed, waiting for the right time to be drawn. After Arthur left, I felt steadier, but that calm did not last long. Days later, Michael called to say he and Sophie wanted to come for dinner. His tone was polite, almost forced, as though he was reading from a script. I agreed, though unease crept into me. I spent the day preparing his favorite roast, the one Thomas used to cook with garlic and rosemary. I wanted to believe food might bridge the gap, even if only for one evening. When they arrived, Sophie breezed through the door with her usual polished charm, carrying a bottle of wine. Michael followed, shoulders tense, eyes tired. I welcomed them warmly, hiding my nerves behind practiced smiles. At the table, I served the roast and potatoes, pouring wine into the glasses. The aroma filled the room, familiar and comforting, but the conversation was anything but. Sophie steered every topic about their plans, their friends, their future. Michael nodded along, speaking little. When I tried to tell a story about Thomas carrying timber through a snowstorm to finish the first lodge, Sophie interrupted with a laugh. "Oh, Linda," she said, her tone sugar-coated but sharp. "Times are different now. Nobody works that way anymore. There are easier paths if you know how to take them." The table laughed with her, Michael included. His smile cut me deeper than if he had shouted. I felt my story dissolve into the silence, unfinished and unwanted. As the meal went on, Sophie casually asked about the lodges. "It must be exhausting managing all those cabins," she said, buttering her bread. "Don't you think it would be easier to let someone younger handle the responsibility?" I saw Michael shift, his fork pausing mid-air. He did not look at me. He looked at her. My heart clenched, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I have managed them for years," I said evenly. "I know every beam, every lock, every guest log. They are part of me." Sophie smiled, but her eyes hardened. "Yes, but part of you deserves rest, don't you think?" Michael finally spoke, his voice low. "She might be right, Mom. Maybe you've carried this weight long enough." The words stung. I swallowed hard, setting down my fork. Thomas and I built those lodges together. They are more than weight. They are memory. They are promise. Michael sighed, rubbing his temple. "I just don't want you to be overwhelmed. Sophie and I could step in, help manage things. It would give you peace." Peace. They used that word as though it were a gift they could hand me, when, in truth, it was the very thing they were trying to steal. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I reached for my glass, letting the silence stretch. It unsettled Sophie. She cleared her throat, filling the void with chatter about investments, about growth, about what could be done with the lodges if they were modernized. I looked at Michael, searching for a flicker of the boy he once was, the boy who had run through those cabins with scraped knees and laughter. All I saw was a man leaning into another person's dream, not his own. Dinner ended stiffly. Sophie thanked me for the meal, her smile tight. Michael hugged me, but it was quick, distracted, his mind elsewhere. When the door closed behind them, I sat at the empty table, the dishes cold, the air heavy. The fracture in our family had widened that night. It was not a clean break, loud and obvious. It was subtle, creeping through the silence, growing wider with every word unspoken, every glance avoided. I pressed Thomas's handkerchief to my chest and whispered, "They are slipping away from me." My voice cracked, but I forced myself to breathe steady. The lodges stood firm outside in the snow, their roofs catching the moonlight, and I told myself I had to be as strong as they were. Still, I could not shake the truth. Love had turned into leverage at my own table, and nothing fractures a family more quietly, more permanently, than when love is bartered for power. After that dinner, the silence of my house felt heavier than usual. I set the plates in the sink, wiped the table, and let the hum of the refrigerator be the only sound in the room. My heart was restless, my mind circling words Sophie had said. Responsibility, easier, rest, each word a polite dagger. I did not sleep well that night. I lay awake, listening to the wind in the pines outside, the sound like whispers through hollow bones. The next morning, I brewed tea early and stood at the window watching the snow drift down the mountain. That was when I saw Eleanor walking along the road, her scarf pulled tight, a covered dish in her hands. She had a way of appearing when I needed her most, without announcement or ceremony. I opened the door before she could knock. "Cold morning," she said, stepping inside and shaking snow from her boots. She set the dish on my counter. "Pot pie, still warm." Her kindness felt like a balm. We sat at the table, steam rising from our cups. Eleanor looked at me with the sharp eyes of a woman who had seen too much to be fooled by polite smiles. "You look thinner than last week," she said bluntly. "What happened?" I hesitated, then told her about the dinner, about Sophie's words, Michael's silence, the way love now sounded like negotiation. Eleanor did not interrupt. She cut a piece of pot pie, chewed slowly, then placed her fork down with care. "My nephew tried that once," she said finally. "Came over with a notary and papers after Frank died. Told me it was for my own good. I almost signed. Almost." Her voice carried the weight of years, of battles fought behind closed doors. "What stopped you?" I asked. Eleanor folded her hands. "A memory. Frank's last words to me. He said, 'Do not hand over what we bled for.' I kept hearing that when the pen was in my hand, so I laid it down." Her story sent a shiver through me. "And what happened?" "He stopped calling for a while, told the family I was stubborn. Some believed him. Some didn't. But the important part is, I kept my home, my life. And in time, they learned I would not bend." I felt my throat tighten. "Didn't it break you? Being called stubborn? Being painted as the villain?" Eleanor's eyes softened, though her mouth remained firm. "It broke me for a season. But seasons change, and when the snow melted, I was still standing. That is all that matters." We sat in quiet for a moment. The snow outside thickened, covering the path she had walked up. I traced the rim of my cup and thought of Thomas's hand gripping mine, whispering his own warning not to sign, not to trust too easily. "You remind me of myself," Eleanor said, "and I want you to remember this. Silence is not weakness. It can be armor. But armor is only useful if you also know when to lift your head high and look someone in the eye. Do you understand?" I nodded slowly, the words sinking deep. She reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. Her palm was warm, steady. "You are not alone, Linda. These mountains are full of women like us. We have survived husbands, winters, and the quiet cruelty of people who think we are too soft to resist. But we resist anyway." Her words steadied me more than any legal paper could. For the first time since Michael and Sophie's visit, I felt less like prey and more like someone who could endure. When Eleanor left, the snow had stopped. The road glistened with fresh powder, unmarked by footsteps. I stood at the doorway, watching her walk back to her cabin, her shoulders square, her scarf fluttering like a banner of defiance. Inside, I looked at the safe in the hallway. The brass key in my pocket grew warmer, as if reminding me it was still mine to hold. I whispered to Thomas, to myself, to the silence, "I will not sign. I will stand." And for the first time in weeks, I believed it fully. That night, after Eleanor left, the house was quiet, but not empty. Her words lingered in the air, like the scent of the pot pie she had brought. "Silence is armor." I repeated it to myself while placing the leftovers in the fridge. It was a truth I had known, but one I needed to hear from another woman who had survived the same storm. The snow outside thickened as darkness fell. By the time I lit the lamp in the living room, the world was wrapped in white. I stood at the window, watching flakes fall against the glass, each one vanishing the moment it touched. I remembered how Thomas used to stand here with me, his arm around my shoulders, whispering that snow was proof of time's patience. Each flake soft, fleeting, but together they remade the entire world overnight. I carried that thought with me as I sat down at my small desk. The drawer held a stack of stationery, cream-colored, faint blue lines. I had begun writing letters to Thomas after his death, letters I never sent, but could not stop composing. Tonight, the snow called me to write again. I began, "Dear Thomas." My pen moved slowly, but my thoughts poured out. I told him about Michael's dinner, about Sophie's sharp questions, about the way their voices braided together like rope meant to bind me. I confessed how tired I felt, how fractured my heart was to see our son drift farther away. The words blurred once or twice as tears dropped onto the page. I let them stain, refusing to blot them away. They were part of the truth. I told him about Eleanor, too, her courage, her memory of Frank, her warning. I wrote that she reminded me of him, in her way, blunt, unyielding, carrying wisdom carved from grief. I ended the letter the same way I always did, with a promise. I will not sign. Not today, not tomorrow. I folded the paper, slid it into the growing stack in the drawer, and closed it gently, as though tucking a child to sleep. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the silence. I made tea, set out 2 cups, one for me and one for the memory of him. As steam curled upward, I closed my eyes and let myself drift into memories. There was one snow still crusted the porch steps from the storm that blew through the night before. I had stayed awake at the wood stove, turning Thomas's handkerchief in my fingers, letting memories settle like frost on the panes. Morning came hard and clear, the sky a cold blue that made everything look honest. I welcomed the honesty. It steadied me. By noon, I heard tires on the gravel. I did not rush. I set water to boil and placed the handkerchief in the center of the table like a small flag. When I opened the door, Sophie stepped in first, cheeks bright, eyes sharp. Behind her was the same attorney. Michael followed, shoulders hunched against more than the cold. "We should sit," Sophie said, moving as if the house belonged to her. The attorney set out a stack of documents. Michael stood by the window, not meeting my eyes. I poured tea. The kettle hissed. Sophie clasped her hands. We brought a revised power of attorney. Narrow scope, limited duration, strict oversight. Your comfort matters to us. She said comfort the way a salesman says guarantee. The attorney slid the pages toward me, pen uncapped. Michael finally spoke. "Mom, this is better. It only covers routine management. Nothing big." I traced the stitched T with my thumb and watched the steam lift from the cups. Paper smelled of toner. The room smelled of pine and tea. Sophie leaned forward. "We can refinance 2 lodges, upgrade the rest, scale bookings. You would receive a monthly stipend, generous and automatic. No more stress." I let a spoon chime against porcelain. The sound rang clean. I breathed once, twice. The attorney tapped a line. "Here is where you initial. Here is the signature. 1 stroke, Mrs. Marlowe." Sophie added a softer blade. "Please do not make this harder than it needs to be. We are family." Michael's voice was rough. "My company is stretched thin. If a client pulls out, we will be underwater. This gives us room to breathe." There it was, the truth crossing open snow. Exhaustion bruised his eyes. Hope and panic wrestled behind them. I set the spoon down and placed my palm on the handkerchief. Silence filled the room. Sophie's smile faltered. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Michael stared at the floorboards Thomas had laid. When I spoke, my voice was even. "All documents must go through my attorney, Arthur Blake. Send drafts to him." Sophie laughed without humor. "Arthur enjoys complicating simple matters. We are standing right here. You can sign and be done." "No," I said. The single word held like a beam. It did not tremble. Sophie's tone sharpened. "Do you understand the consequences? Without a signature, Michael's creditors could touch marital property. His future is tied to yours." Michael closed his eyes. "Sophie, I folded the top page back without reading it. I will not sign anything today. Speak with Arthur. Sophie pushed the pen toward me. Refusing to help is not love. It is pride dressed as nostalgia. I kept my hands in my lap. Love is not measured by surrender. It is measured by what we protect. Color rose along her neck. You would watch your son fail. I felt the old wound open and did not look away. I would watch my son learn which walls can hold and which must fall. Sophie stood abruptly, chair legs scraping. Michael lingered. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to press pine cones into my palm. He whispered, "Mom, I am scared." I placed the handkerchief in his hand. So am I. That is why we do not sign fear. He closed his fingers around the cloth, then set it back gently as if it carried heat. They left with the folder unopened and the pen uncapped. The house returned to quiet as snow slid from the eaves in slow, heavy clumps. I stood in the stillness and let the quiet settle inside me like a foundation setting true. I brewed tea and phoned Arthur. They came, I said. Good, he answered. Let them come through me. I hung up and sat with the blue winter light. I had not shouted. I had not argued. I placed a square of cloth on a table and spoke one syllable. The axis of the room shifted. I believed that silence could move mountains. 2 days passed after the second attempt. Snow melted slightly, leaving the paths muddy and slick. I spent the mornings tending the fire, evenings with Thomas's handkerchief pressed between my palms, and the nights restless, listening to the roof groan under shifting ice. I thought perhaps there might be a pause, that Sophie would regroup before returning. But it was not Sophie who came first. It was Michael. Alone. I saw his truck at the edge of the drive, tires caked in slush. He sat behind the wheel longer than usual, his shoulders slumped. Finally, he stepped out and walked toward the porch, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. When I opened the door, he managed a tired smile. "Mom?" he said, almost softly. I ushered him inside, poured coffee, and set it before him at the kitchen table. He wrapped his hands around the mug, but didn't drink. His eyes looked older, as if the years had sped forward in just a few months. "Mom, we need to talk," he began. My heart braced. "Then talk," I said gently. He drew a long breath, staring at the steam rising from the cup. "I know Sophie comes across strong, and I know the papers feel like pressure, but you have to understand, my business is crumbling. One contract fell through, another is delayed. Debts are mounting. Without new capital, I could lose everything. Sophie believes the lodges are the answer. She thinks refinancing them could cover the gap." I listened, silent. His voice carried desperation, but beneath it, shame. He looked at me finally. "Do you want to see me fail, Mom? Do you want me to lose everything I've worked for?" The words struck, sharp and unfair. Still, I held my calm. "I want to see you stand on your own feet," I replied. "Not on the ashes of what your father built." He flinched. "That's cruel." "It's truth," I said. My voice did not rise. "Your father spent years carving beams from these mountains. He bled on those floorboards. The lodges were not built to bail out someone else's debts. They were built to hold this family together." He pushed back from the table, pacing. "You always make it about Dad, about promises and memory. What about me? Don't I matter? Don't my struggles count?" I felt my chest ache, but I did not let it bend me. "You matter, more than you know. But if you measure my love by signatures on paper, then you do not understand it at all." His steps faltered. He pressed a hand to his face, then dropped it, eyes raw. Sophie says you're stubborn, that you're letting fear make decisions. Maybe she's right. Maybe you just can't let go. I folded my hands over the handkerchief. Stubbornness is refusing to see truth. Strength is knowing when silence protects. I will not sign, Michael. Not for Sophie. Not even for you. His face twisted between anger and grief. For a moment, I saw the little boy who had once begged me to fix a broken toy, who had trusted me with his tears. Now that boy stood in a man's body, torn between his wife's voice and his mother's silence. He slammed his hand against the table, rattling the cups. "Then you leave me no choice." The echo rang through the kitchen. I did not flinch. I only met his eyes. "There is always a choice, son. Yours is whether to see me as your enemy or as the woman who raised you." Silence followed. His shoulders sagged. His breath came heavy. He sat again, burying his face in his hands. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Only the clock ticked steadily on the wall. When he finally looked at me, his eyes glistened. "I don't know who I am anymore." I reached across the table, touched his hand gently. "You are still my son. But you must decide if being my son means loving me or using me." He pulled his hand back slowly, stood, and walked to the door. He hesitated, as if wanting to say something more, but he only whispered, "I'm sorry," before stepping out into the snow. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading down the drive. And I knew the fracture had deepened, but I also knew my silence had drawn a line that could not be erased. The morning after Michael left, the house felt emptier than ever. His words still clung to the walls, sharp and echoing. I sat at the table staring at the handkerchief, tracing the embroidered letter as though it could answer the questions swirling inside me. I had stood my ground, but the fracture widened. The silence between mother and son had grown into something heavier than any snowdrift outside. By mid-morning, a knock came at the door. I half expected Michael, but when I opened it, Eleanor stood there, her scarf flapping in the wind, her cheeks red from the cold. She carried no dish this time, only herself and the kind of resolve I had come to trust. "I was walking by," she said simply, "and I thought you might need company." I let her in without words. She removed her gloves slowly, watching me. "You look like you didn't sleep," she remarked. "I didn't," I admitted. We sat at the table. I poured tea, and she wrapped her hands around the cup, though she didn't drink. For a long moment, we said nothing. Two women sitting in silence, both knowing the weight silence can carry. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I saw Michael's truck yesterday. Did he come alone?" I nodded. "Yes, and he came with his heart torn open. He asked if I wanted him to fail. He said refusing meant I didn't love him." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And what did you say?" I told him love isn't measured by signatures. It's measured by what we protect. He didn't accept it. He left angry, sad. Maybe both. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as though releasing her own memories. "My nephew said the same once, accused me of selfishness. He told me family meant sacrifice, and I told him family also means boundaries. He didn't like hearing it. But he needed to." Her words sank deep. "Boundaries," I repeated, tasting the word. Eleanor leaned closer. "Listen, Linda. Women like us, we were raised to keep the peace, to yield, to place our worth in how well we bend. But there comes a day when bending breaks us. And you, my friend, are standing at that day." I swallowed hard, the truth of it pressing against my chest. "It hurts, Eleanor. to see him like that, to hear my own son speak as though love is something to be traded. She reached across the table, covering my hand. It will hurt. But hurt is not the end. Sometimes it's the start of clarity. Do not confuse his pain with your failure. His choices are his own. Your choice is to remain whole. Her grip was firm, steady, like the lodges rooted in the mountain. I looked into her eyes. Do you ever regret it? Saying no? Drawing that line? Her gaze softened but didn't waver. I regret the years we lost. I regret the silence at holidays, the empty chair at my table. But I do not regret standing. Because when I look at my home, when I walk through rooms Frank built, I know I honored him. And in time, my nephew understood. It took years, but he came back, not for money, but for truth. Her story cracked something inside me, not in despair, but in recognition. I don't know if Michael will ever come back, I whispered. Then let him find his way, Eleanor said. You cannot hold a man steady by giving him what he demands. You hold him steady by showing him where the ground truly is. Her words filled the room like firelight, warming corners that had grown cold. For the first time since the fight with Michael, I felt my breath steady. Thank you, I said. Eleanor smiled faintly. We survive by reminding each other of what we already know. When she left, the snow had stopped falling. The road stretched clean and unbroken down the ridge. I stood at the window long after she disappeared from sight, repeating her word to myself like a prayer. Boundaries. And I knew that was what love demanded now. Not surrender, not silence for silence's sake, but boundaries. 2 days after Eleanor's visit, I received a call from Arthur Blake. His voice, calm and deliberate as ever, carried a certain weight that made me grip the receiver tighter. Linda, he said, I think it's time we met again. I have something you need to see. We arranged to meet at his office in town, a modest building near the courthouse. The drive down the mountain was long and winding, but the road was clear. I kept Thomas's handkerchief in my pocket, folded neatly as though it were a compass guiding me. Arthur greeted me at the door. His office smelled faintly of old books and pine cleaner. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, but one file sat open in the center. He gestured for me to sit, his eyes steady on mine. Linda, he began, you've shown incredible strength. But strength alone won't protect you if they keep pressing. What you need is proof, clear and irrefutable. He slid the open file toward me. Inside were copies of legal documents, thick with signatures and stamps. My eyes caught Thomas's handwriting, bold and deliberate, at the bottom of a trust declaration. Arthur tapped the page. This is the cornerstone. Thomas and I worked on this trust 15 years ago. It states clearly that the mountain lodges cannot be transferred, sold, or refinanced without your explicit consent. And that consent must be given freely, in writing, before a judge. I traced Thomas's name with my finger. The ink was faded, but the intention was alive, breathing between the lines. Arthur leaned back. This means that all Sophie's attempts, all her papers, all her pressure, are powerless unless you yourself agree. And even if you sign under duress, I could contest it. The law is on your side. Relief surged through me, mingled with sorrow. He really thought this far ahead? I asked softly. Arthur nodded. Thomas knew human nature. He knew money can turn kin into strangers. He told me, make it airtight. Linda must never be forced to choose between loyalty and survival. And that's what we did. Tears blurred my eyes. For years, I had carried his handkerchief as a memory. Now I saw that his love had left more than fabric. It had left a shield made of law. Arthur pulled another document from the folder. "This," he explained, "is an affidavit from a notary who witnessed Thomas's signing. It confirms he understood every word and intended to protect you. If Sophie or anyone tries to argue otherwise, this testimony stands." I felt my spine straighten as I read. Each stamped seal, each notarized line, felt like Thomas's hand resting on my shoulder. Arthur wasn't finished. He handed me a small envelope. "Inside are certified copies you should keep at home. And here," he placed a card in front of me, "is my direct number. If they come again, call me. I will handle them." I clutched the envelope, a strange calm settling over me. For weeks I had lived in silence, resisting with nothing but steadiness. Now I had more. Now I had proof. As I prepared to leave, Arthur said something that stayed with me. "Linda, remember this. Silence is power, but law is armor. Together, they make you untouchable." The drive back up the ridge felt lighter. Snow glistened on the pines, and the lodges stood tall against the winter sky. When I stepped inside my house, I placed the envelope in the safe beneath the hallway rug. My hands did not tremble. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the handkerchief in one hand and Thomas's signature in the other. I whispered, "You protected me even now." And for the first time, I realized my silence was no longer just defense. It was choice. Backed by proof, shielded by law, it became unbreakable. I folded the papers carefully, placed them with the letters I had written, and closed the drawer. The storm would return, I knew. Sophie would not rest, but I was ready. Because now I held not only memory, but evidence. The days after my meeting with Arthur passed in uneasy quiet. I kept the certified copies of the trust locked in my safe, the envelope tucked beneath quilts Thomas and I had stitched long ago. I told myself that paper and ink were armor, but even armor cannot soften the sting of family breaking apart. It was Sunday when Michael and Sophie came again. They did not call ahead. Their truck pulled up as the bells from town drifted faintly across the valley. I was on the porch, sweeping snow from the steps, when Sophie marched forward, her coat snapping in the wind like a flag. Michael followed, his face pale, jaw set. "Linda," Sophie began sharply, "this has gone on long enough." Her voice was polished steel, loud enough for the pines to hear. Michael stood behind her, silent, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I lowered the broom and met her gaze. "Come inside," I said evenly. At the table, Sophie wasted no time. She pulled out another folder, thicker than before. "We spoke to an investor," she declared. "He's interested in the lodges. With your signature, we could secure a deal that saves Michael's company. Without it, you leave him drowning." Michael flinched at the word drowning, as if the water were already rising around his chest. I poured tea, steadying my hands with practiced ritual. The steam curled upward, fragile but sure. "You know my answer," I said quietly. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Your silence is cruelty. You call it protection, but it is pride. Michael is your son. He deserves your support." I looked at him, not her. "Michael, is this what you believe?" His eyes wavered, torn. "Mom, I don't want to fight you, but Sophie is right. We're out of options. If you love me—" The words twisted like a knife. I held up my hand, stopping him. "Do not measure my love by what I sign away. That is not love. That is ransom." The air in the room grew heavy. Sophie's smile vanished, replaced by something colder. Then you force us to act, she snapped. I reached into the drawer beside me and placed the certified copy of the trust on the table. The paper landed with a sharp slap. Sophie froze. Michael's eyes widened. This, I said calmly, is Thomas's will and trust. It states clearly that no transfer, no refinancing, no sale can happen without my free and willing consent before a judge, which means your folders, your investors, your threats, they mean nothing. The silence that followed was thick as stone. Sophie's face flushed crimson. Michael's lips parted, but no words came. I continued, my voice steady. Thomas prepared for this day. He knew what family can become when money blinds love. He made sure the lodges would remain safe unless I chose otherwise. And I choose to protect them. Michael stepped forward, his voice breaking. Mom, please. I shook my head, my heart aching but firm. No, Michael, I will not surrender your father's life's work. Not for debt, not for comfort, not even for you. You must find another way. The final fracture came then, not with shouting, but with silence. Michael turned away, his shoulders slumping, his face hidden. Sophie gathered her folder with trembling hands, fury tightening her jaw. You'll regret this, she hissed. I rose slowly, placing Thomas's handkerchief on the table like a seal. I have lived with regret before, but I will not regret protecting what we built. Sophie stormed out, her heels striking the floor like hammers. Michael lingered one moment longer, staring at the trust papers. His lips moved as though he wanted to speak, but no sound came. Then he followed her into the cold. I stood alone in the quiet house. The kettle whistled faintly on the stove, the only sound breaking the silence. My heart cracked, but inside that crack was light, because even as my family fractured, I had chosen truth. I pressed the handkerchief to my chest and whispered, I will endure. And though the silence hurt, it was the silence of strength. The Sunday after the confrontation, I forced myself to attend the church service in town. The lodge felt too heavy, too filled with echoes of Sophie's sharp words and Michael's broken silence. I needed to be among people, to sit where hymns lifted, instead of accusations. The church was simple, white clapboard with stained glass windows that caught the winter sun in colors of amber and blue. I slipped into a pew near the back, pulling Thomas's handkerchief from my pocket and folding it in my hands. It had become my anchor. After the service ended, the women of the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall. Tables were lined with casseroles, pies, and the scent of coffee. These women had known me for decades. Some had watched Michael grow from boy to man, had shared their own burdens with me across bake sales and funerals. Today, they gathered me in with the same quiet strength. Linda, you look tired, Mrs. Porter said gently, placing a hand on my arm. I am, I admitted. I was too weary for pretense. Eleanor was there too, her presence as steady as ever. She guided me to a table where the women sat close, leaning in, their voices hushed but strong. I told them, haltingly at first, about the visits, the papers, the pressure. I did not speak to shame my son, but because silence had grown too heavy to carry alone. Their faces reflected sorrow, anger, recognition. One woman, Clara, spoke first. My daughter tried to move me into assisted living so she could sell our farm. She told me it was for my safety, but what she meant was convenience. I said no. She didn't speak to me for a year. Another, Miriam, added, my grandson forged my name once. I found out before it reached the bank. He said it was desperation, but desperation does not excuse betrayal. Their stories poured out like a river breaking its banks. Each woman had faced her own fracture, her own silence, her own test of love twisted into leverage. I listened, tears stinging my eyes. I was not alone. My story was not singular. It was a thread in a much larger fabric of women who had built, protected, endured, and who had been asked again and again to surrender what they held most dear. Eleanor looked at me across the table. You see, Linda, this is not only your battle, it is ours. And when one of us stands, we all stand a little taller. Her words spread warmth through me. The other women nodded, some reaching out to squeeze my hand. Mrs. Porter leaned close. Do not let guilt confuse you. A son's love should not depend on property. If it does, then it is not love. It is transaction. And transaction is not what mothers are here for. The room hummed with agreement. These were women who had buried husbands, raised children through storms, survived winters with empty cupboards. They understood sacrifice, but they also understood betrayal cloaked in sweet words. For the first time, I felt my silence shift from lonely to communal. It was no longer only my shield. It was part of a chorus of women who had learned the same lesson. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that refuses to yield. We ended our gathering with prayer, hands linked around the table. I felt their warmth radiate through me, steadier than any lawyer's proof, deeper than any court's decree. This was proof of another kind, the proof that I was not isolated, not broken, not wrong. When I walked back into the cold afternoon, the sky was bright, the snow crunching beneath my boots. I held Thomas's handkerchief in one hand and the memory of those women's stories in the other. Together, they steadied me. The fracture in my family remained, but I no longer felt it alone. The weight was lighter, carried by many hands, many hearts. As I reached my car, Eleanor caught my arm and said quietly, "Remember, Linda, silence can protect, but solidarity can heal." I nodded, tucking the handkerchief back into my pocket. For the first time in weeks, I felt not only strong, but accompanied. The week after the church gathering, I found myself waking earlier than usual. Dawn light spilled across the ridges, painting the snow a pale gold. I sat at the table with a cup of tea, Thomas's handkerchief resting beneath my palm, and I realized something had shifted. The fracture in my family still hurt, but the voices of those women at church echoed in me. Their stories had woven a net strong enough to catch my grief. I moved through the house more steadily, my steps less heavy. I checked the ledgers for the lodges, made calls to caretakers, and planned repairs for spring. Each act of management reminded me I was capable. Sophie's words about exhaustion no longer clung to me like frost. They melted under the warmth of proof and solidarity. One evening, as snow fell softly against the windows, I sat by the fire and opened the letters I had written weeks ago, but never mailed. They were filled with questions, doubts, fragments of memory. Reading them now, I saw not weakness, but survival. I had poured out my heart onto paper to keep from drowning in silence. And now, silence no longer felt like drowning. It felt like breathing. Arthur called midweek to check in. His voice was firm, reassuring. "Remember, Linda," he said, "you hold the key. No one can move without you." "I know," I replied. "And for the first time, I believe it." He paused, then added, "Belief is as strong as proof. Do not underestimate that." After the call, I walked outside into the snow. The lodges stood tall against the night sky, roofs heavy with white, windows glowing faintly where caretakers kept fires burning. They looked like sentinels, holding watch over the ridge. I whispered into the cold air, "We are still standing." That night, I dreamed of Thomas, not the weary man at the end, but the strong one, hauling beams, laughing as the sawdust clung to his hair. In the dream, he handed me the handkerchief and said, "It is enough, Linda. You are enough." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but they were not the bitter kind. They were warm, like release. The next morning, Michael's truck appeared in the drive. My heart tightened, but I did not retreat. I opened the door before he knocked. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed, but there was no folder in his hands, no pen, no lawyer. Just my son, weary and uncertain. "Mom," he said softly, "can I come in?" We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many battles had simmered. The kettle hissed on the stove, steam rising in familiar curls. "I don't know how to fix this," Michael admitted, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them around the mug I placed before him. "Sophie, she's furious. She says I'm weak for not making you sign. She says I'm choosing you over our future." I listened without interrupting. The silence stretched, not as a wall, but as a space for him to pour his truth. Finally, he looked at me, eyes searching. "Am I weak, Mom?" I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. "No, Michael, you are not weak. You are lost, and being lost is not weakness. It is the beginning of finding your way back." He blinked hard, tears brimming. "I don't know if Sophie will stay if I don't deliver what she wants." "Then perhaps," I said gently, "you need to ask yourself if what she wants is the same as what you need. Love should not demand signatures. It should not measure itself in deeds and dollars." His shoulders slumped, but there was relief in the way he exhaled. For the first time in weeks, he let silence settle between us, without rushing to fill it with arguments. I pressed the handkerchief into his palm. "This cloth has carried me through storms. Let it remind you that strength is not loud. Sometimes it is the choice to be still." He held it, his fingers trembling. For a long while, we sat like that, mother and son, saying little. Trust was not rebuilt in a single night, but in the quiet, I felt the faintest thread forming again, fragile, yet real. And in that silence, I believed it was enough to begin. 2 mornings after Michael's visit, I walked the path toward the largest of the mountain lodges. The snow had thinned into patches of ice, the ground showing beneath in dark streaks. My boots crunched with each step, and the cold air bit my lungs in that clean, bracing way that mountain winters always did. I carried no papers, no folders, only Thomas's handkerchief in my pocket and a ring of keys in my hand. When I reached the lodge, I paused before the heavy oak door. Its surface was scarred from years of storms, but the grain shone through, proud and unbroken. I ran my palm across it, feeling the grooves Thomas had once smoothed with his tools. This door had welcomed hunters, travelers, families, and strangers. It had sheltered laughter and sorrow. It had been both a threshold and a shield. I slid the key into the lock, turning it slowly. The familiar click echoed like a heartbeat. When I stepped inside, the air smelled of pine logs, wool blankets, and faint smoke from the hearth. Dust motes swirled in the slant of sunlight breaking through the shutters. The lodge was quiet, but it held memory in every corner. I walked across the wooden floor, hearing its creak beneath me. I pictured Thomas kneeling here, hammer in hand, sweat dripping as he worked late into the night. I pictured Michael as a boy, running through the doorway with snow on his boots, shouting that he had built a fort in the woods. Those images pressed against me, heavy and tender. I sat at the long dining table, its surface nicked from years of plates and mugs. How many times had we gathered here? How many voices had risen in warmth? Now silence filled the space. Yet it was not empty. It was alive with echoes. I unfolded the handkerchief and placed it on the table. The embroidered T faced upward, catching the light. I whispered, "We kept it, Thomas. We kept it safe." For a long while, I simply breathed. The quiet was not loneliness. It was recognition. This lodge, these walls, this door, they had outlasted storms and schemes. They would outlast Sophie's fury. They would stand because I stood. A knock startled me. My heart jolted. I rose and opened the door. It was Eleanor, bundled in her coat, cheeks flushed from the walk. She carried no food, no folder, only her presence. "You're here early," she said with a small smile. "I thought you might be." I stepped aside. "Come in." She moved through the room slowly, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the mantel. "It feels alive in here," she murmured. "It is," I said. "Every beam has a memory." We sat together at the table. Eleanor looked at the handkerchief, then at me. "You know, doors are more than wood. They're decisions. They open when we choose, and they close when we must. This one has guarded you longer than you realize." Her words pierced deep. I glanced at the oak door, strong and steady. I thought of all the times I had stood before doors. Hospital doors, courtroom doors, even the door of my own son's home, wondering what waited behind them. This door, though, belonged to me. Eleanor leaned closer. "Michael may come again, Sophie too. But remember, this door only opens if you choose. That is the gift Thomas left you. That is the truth the law protects." I nodded slowly, letting the meaning settle. We drank tea from thermoses she had carried. The warmth spread through me. I realized then that my trust, my silence, my boundaries, they were not cages. They were doors I could open or close with dignity. When Eleanor left, I stood at the doorway, the key still in my hand. I locked it firmly, the sound ringing in my chest, like a bell. I whispered into the cold mountain air. This door stands, and so did I. Winter slowly yielded to spring. The snow on the ridge melted into streams that cut through the valley, carrying the weight of the season away. The lodges, sturdy as ever, stood framed by budding pines. I walked among them often, listening to the creak of thawing wood and the rush of water below. The mountains reminded me of what endurance truly meant: to weather storms without needing to shout back at the wind. Michael had not returned since our last conversation. Weeks passed in silence, and though my heart ached, I no longer filled the quiet with doubt. Silence had become my companion, not my enemy. It was the same silence that had carried me through Thomas's absence, the silence that had protected the lodges when signatures were demanded, the silence that taught me strength does not always roar. I spent my days repairing shutters, overseeing caretakers, and writing in my journal. Some pages held memories of Thomas, others questions for Michael, and still others simple observations of the mountain's rhythm. I wrote not to persuade anyone else, but to remind myself that I was still here, still whole. Eleanor visited often. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we sat together without words, our companionship rooted in the comfort of understanding. One afternoon, as we shared tea on the porch, she said, "You know, Linda, Healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about living fully even with the cracks. I looked at the lodges, standing tall against the horizon, and knew she was right. Cracks do not erase strength. They reveal where light enters. The women at church became my circle of strength too. We exchanged stories, not as victims, but as survivors. Their voices echoed in me when I felt loneliness creep in. Clara's determination, Miriam's resilience, Eleanor's wisdom, all of it stitched into me like Thomas's initials on the handkerchief. And then, one quiet evening, as I stood outside locking the main lodge door, I saw a figure at the edge of the drive. Michael. He did not approach right away. He lingered, uncertain, his hands in his pockets. The setting sun painted him in gold and shadow. I did not move to close the distance. I simply stood, letting the silence stretch between us. Finally, he walked forward, stopping a few feet away. "Mom," he said, his voice rough, "I don't expect forgiveness tonight. I just wanted you to know Sophie left." The words struck deep. His eyes shimmered, not with anger this time, but with exhaustion and a strange humility. "I don't know what happens next," he continued, "but I remember building forts in these woods. I remember Dad carrying beams up the ridge. And I remember you, always steady. Maybe I forgot that for a while." I didn't answer right away. The mountains around us seemed to breathe with me. At last, I said, "Michael, doors are not locked forever, but you must choose how you walk through them." He nodded, tears spilling despite himself. He didn't ask for the lodges, for signatures, for money. He only stood there, broken but honest. And that was enough for now. When he left, I did not feel despair. I felt something fragile but alive, a thread waiting to be rewoven in time. As night fell, I sat by the fire with Thomas's handkerchief in my lap. I whispered, "We endured, Thomas. We stood." My voice did not shake. This is not a story of triumph in the loud sense. It is a story of thresholds, of choosing when to open and when to hold firm, of silence used not to hide, but to protect. To anyone who listens, I say this: love is not measured by surrender. It is measured by what we preserve, by the boundaries we honor, and by the quiet strength to stand when others demand we yield. So I leave my story with you, the way the mountains leave their imprint on the valley, with endurance, with silence, with hope. And now I ask you, if you were in my place, would you sign? Or would you stand?